Hi everyone, welcome to Meet the Poet with me, Florrie Crass, and our two guest poets, Anne Osbourn and Heidi Williamson. As always, it's great to have you all tuning in at home to be with us virtually and hear what I'm sure is a wonderful selection of poetry. So our two guests, as I said, are Anne and Heidi, and they both live in Norfolk. Their paths into the poetry world have been quite different, but there is a surprising synergy in the focus of their work, which we'll hear tonight. So let me give you a short introduction. Heidi Williamson studied poetry and prose at the University of East Anglia. She now leads regular poetry workshops, monthly poetry seminars for the Poetry School, and she also mentors for the Poetry Society, the National Centre for Writing, and the Writing Coach. Heidi has published 3 poetry collections, all with Blood Axe Books. She's won various prizes, and her first collection was a Poetry Book Society recommendation, and was also shortlisted for the Seamus Heaney Centre Prize for Poetry in 2012. Her second collection won the Poetry category and the Book by the Cover Awards in the 2016 East Anglian Book Awards. Anne Osbourn is a scientist, professor of biology at the John Innes Centre. She investigates plant natural product biosynthesis and was awarded an OBE in January 2020 for services to plant science. In 2004, Anne was appointed to the UEA Creative Writing course as a Dreamtime Fellow for the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. Here she began to write poetry more seriously and consequently published her first book of poetry, which we'll be hearing from tonight, which is called Mock Orange. And this was a Sentinel Poetry Book Prize winner in 2018. So let's kickstart the event and welcome Anne and Heidi to the online stage. So hi both, how are you doing?
Hi, good, thank you.
Hi,
Good.
great to see
It's
you
lovely
both.
to have you. It's lovely to have you here. So you've known each other for a while. I thought we could just start by you telling us maybe how you two met.
I became quite interested in science as something to pursue, to think about with poetry. And I contacted, there was an organisation called SciTalk who paired up scientists and writers. And Anne came through on that, and we met each other and we got on, and we've kind of since worked together quite a lot, haven't we, Anne?
Over nearly 20 years.
It was a long time ago. It was before my first book. It was when I was kind of starting to get into writing poetry. So yeah, we've worked together on quite a few different things, haven't we? But also SOAR has been a big part of it, the organisation that you set up as part of your Nesta Fellowship.
Yeah, Anne, would you like to talk a little bit about SOAR?
Yeah, so SOAR sort of happened by accident because I became very interested in using science and scientific images as a starting point for creative exploration through poetry and also through art. And this sort of accidentally developed into an initiative that's been running in schools since 2004. And it uses scientific theme as a meeting place, supported by stunning scientific images that draw people in. And so we do this mainly in primary schools, but we've also done it with adults. And the activities involve doing some practical science, writing poetry, and then doing some visual artwork all around a theme, which could be magnetism or bubbles or chemicals that plants make. And so it's really taken off, and Heidi's made some great contributions to the development of SOAR. It's good fun.
It sounds it. Sounds like a really great initiative, and it begins really nicely. This interesting overlap with poetry and science, which you both sort of delve into, and which we'll hear about with your poetry. So up first, we'll be hearing a reading from you, Anne. And I thought before we hear your first reading, I wondered if you could just tell our audience a little bit about being a Dreamtime Fellow and taking part in the UEA Creative Writing course, because that was really where poetry sort of began for you, wasn't it?
Well, this Dreamtime Fellowship was they're for people who, or it doesn't exist anymore, but the programme was for people who were established in science, the arts or technology to go and spend up to a year doing something radically different. And so I applied to go to the School of Literature and Creative Writing at the University of East Anglia. But it wasn't a taught course. I had a mentor, Clive Scott, who was wonderful. And I met with him once a week. And that was it. I was out in the wilderness, and I accidentally started writing poetry just before I did this sabbatical. And I thought I would have been writing prose. So it was a hell of a shock to suddenly think, what is this thing called poetry? And luckily I met people like Heidi and others along the way. But it was quite it still is a journey. It always will be.
So, I mean, you're a scientist, but have you always had this creative streak?
I've always loved creative writing, and at school I enjoyed English very much, but because of the constraints of the curriculum, I wasn't able to do a combination of science and English at A-level. And so I had to make a decision, and I always felt I'd left something behind. And my parents, my father's died now, but they were both literary people. So my sister and I grew up in a house full of books. And I think partly we thought, well, those will still be there anyway, and mum and dad know everything about literature. And so we both went off to become scientists, but it was nice. Doing the sabbatical was like coming home, really. It's just very comforting.
Yeah. And then the work in Mock Orange, is this, are these poems that have come from that fellowship, or are they poems that you've written separately to that?
It very much started during that 1 year, which was 2004, 2005. But it took until 2019 for the book to be finished and published. But looking back, a lot of the original poems, the bones of those poems are in the published book. And the book is very much an exploration of a personal journey, how I came to be me, how I came to be a scientist, my fascination with plants. And it brings in characters like Linnaeus and Mrs. Linnaeus, and a lot of plants make little appearances in it. So it's very much, I started out trying to write very overtly about science, and that was too crass. It's one of my learning experiences early on in poetry, that you don't just tell, you have to bring things in.
Okay, so I think it's probably time that we heard a bit of your poetry, and your first reading is going to be from Mock Orange. So I'll hand over to you to share your poems.
Thank you. So my first poem is called On Baildon Moor. So there's quite a bit about my childhood in Mock Orange, as well as being an adult research scientist. On Baildon Moor. With my father on the moor, I'm conjuring a snowstorm. The first white flakes stroke my face as we walk across the Druid plain just below Brudden. The sky grey glass is humming a blizzard dance. Faster and faster the crystals sting. Down there the village vanishes, path snuffed out by snow. The moor is going to sleep now. Cotton grass, larks, gainer on horseback, the celandines by the stream, etched, smothered, gone. My moment of sorcery begins to burn, cannot turn us back to thickets of snow-free bracken, bobtails in the quarry, ancient writing on stone. There are snowflakes on my eyelashes. I hold my father's hand, grip the wool of his black overcoat, long to be carried home. He clasps my mittened fingers. Together we run down the slopes, the snow ankle high, until breathless we reach the black stone bridge as the whiteout takes hold. The next poem, I mentioned Linnaeus, who must have been quite a character to live with. And this is inspired by the World's Wives, Mrs. Linnaeus. Mrs. Linnaeus. It was late September. I just put the little one to bed when he comes back from his Arctic trip, smelling of reindeer shit, blowing that damn bugle like there was no tomorrow. He throws his kit bag down on the table, puts his feet up, starts telling me stories of Jumotis, Kvitjik, Sorcerer, the Lap who tried to drink seawater, oh, how they all laughed. I used to love those days in the summer when he would take me through the north gates, so to speak, and out into the meadows, feed me mead made from mountain honey. Now he's become a pain in the arse, sends his students off round the world, collecting cocoa, banana, cassava. Thinks they'll grow here. Sweden, imagine it. Thinks he'll save us all from starvation. I didn't have the heart to tell him about Darwinian adaptation. Half of his students have died of tropical diseases or sunk with ships, including that poor boy Tilland, and I'm the one the wives come to when they want to vent. The house is full of dead plants, insects, ants from exotic places, remnants of reindeer dung. Poor Mrs. Linnaeus. And I have quite a few flowers making their little appearances. And this one is the 4 o'clock plant, otherwise known as Mirabilis jalapa. Mirabilis jalapa opens her flowers at night behind closed doors of darkness, unfurls her petals. She is visited by moths. We pick bunches of her, put her in a cupboard. When we open the door, she is caught, exposed, shyly folds as we watch. And then the last poem, which is a longer poem, comes back to my father when he's much older. So now he's 90 and he's moved down to Norfolk from Yorkshire, and he's decided to go on the internet and all that that entails. It's called Blue Flash. Blue Flash. My father has decided to go on the internet. BT has an offer on. It closes in May. But what about my money? Oh dear, oh bloody hell. Why am I going on the internet? Because it's a big encyclopedia, Dad. You can find out anything, and you don't have to do internet banking. He nods, says slowly, I think what I need is a Kit Kat. The man from BT didn't install the router, just left it. Oh bloody hell, said Dad when I called in. How long can it sit there? What's going to happen? Oh dear, oh bloody hell. Internet installation is beyond my capability. I call Malcolm. Malcolm knows how to do these things. Malcolm and his wife are in the process of adopting. Malcolm can't come round until Thursday. I go to the village shop, buy Kit Kats, enough to tide him over. Malcolm has been and gone. I call in on my way home. I should never have gone on this damn thing. My mother shouts from the kitchen, brings coffee, places the mugs on mats in Dad's room. I want to come off the internet. Why, Dad? It doesn't work. What doesn't work? I can't find you. What do you mean you can't find me? Malcolm found you. I show him how to Google, type in my name. Why are there so many of you? I'm quite busy, Dad. We sit and have a Kit Kat with our coffee in the front room. Mum sits in her chair by the window. The nice young woman across the road has had an anonymous letter again, complaining about the state of her dustbins and the gravel on the pavement that apparently damages dogs' paws. My mother thinks it's the woman from the WI, the one with the purple coat and the dog. The phone rings. It's my sister. Dad and I go back to his room. His tall boy with his important papers, his dressing table, brush, comb, pipe in the top right drawer, dental fixative in the left, the wardrobe with his canvas rucksack on top, the holiday suitcases, and the 4 nearly finished Guardian quick crossword books that I bought because Mother won't let him do the ones in the paper. Once when I was helping him set up his new digital camera, we sat on the bed and took a photograph of ourselves in the dressing table mirror. Can we find my sister? We find her. She's busy too. I call in again on my way home. It doesn't work. What doesn't work? I can't find it. What? the place that we held, the tributary, the Alta Rhine. The Germans were on the other side. Tom, the newsagent, found it when we lived in Eldwick. I install Google Earth. First we find the bungalow, then we swoop along the Rhine, try to find the tributary. It was too difficult. Oh, bloody hell. We have a Kit Kat sitting on the bed. My father starts, forgetting his stick, that effing stick, my sister calls it. He goes to the spare room, comes back with blue flash, the story of an armoured regiment. He looks up the place name, the nearest village. We type it into Google Earth, sweep in, and there, just to the east, the tributary flows into the Rhine. My father wants to go in further, magnify the V of the promontory. Here it is. He points at a tiny white building. That's the farmhouse that the infantry held. The Rhine flows fast there, in places faster than the top speed of the water buffaloes. Trees slide forwards. The 4th Battalion Royal Tank Regiment will slip under the willows in the dead of night.
That was a beautiful reading, Anne. Thank you so much. I absolutely loved that last poem. That'll stick with me. And just thinking again on that last poem, but also the reading as a whole, it lent quite a lot on your parents and specifically your dad. And I wondered what specifically drove you to write about them.
It was all part of exploring who I am, where I came from. I went back into my childhood. I've also written about my grandparents there in there. I wanted to understand where I was from genetically, how I became a scientist, how I became me. There's quite a bit about my mother in there as well. She actually had her bottom pinched by Salvador Dali in about 1950. Well,
Really?
I don't think I look like Dali, and I'm too young to be a product of that. She went to his house. So there's lots of stuff. And if I hadn't have spoken to my parents about it, I wouldn't have found all of this out, particularly before my father died.
Yeah. Do you think that you come to any sort of conclusions in the book about how you got to where you are now, or are you still in that process of discovering?
I'm still in the process of discovering, but there's so much social history came out of it, looking back at where my grandparents in Blackpool lived and going into the census details and going to find every house in Blackpool that my grandmother lived in from the age of, from when she was born, and seeing how, they progressed. They're all rented houses, from tiny houses to one with a bow window, which was a big statement. So I've done a lot of ancestry stuff as well, which is kind of in the background to all of this. So it's been really interesting, but it's always a learning process.
Definitely. It was a gorgeous reading, Anne. Thank you so much. Great to kick us off with. And we're going to hand over to Heidi now for your first reading, which does delve into some sort of scientific ideas. And I mean, as we've talked about, Heidi, you and Anne have worked together, sort of bridging science and poetry. I wondered, why are you interested in this side of it? Why do you want to bring science into poetry?
I was sort of flailing about following individual poems, trying to decide what to write. And a friend of mine had a topic that she was really interested in, that she was pursuing. And I thought, well, is there anything that I'm really interested in that I could kind of set myself a brief and start to write poems about? And I'd always enjoyed science at school, but like Anne, my path sort of diverged. I went down the literature side. I did French and English. But I always really enjoyed physics and biology and chemistry and maths and those kind of things. So I thought, well, if I kind of explore scientific ideas, then that might give me something that I could pursue and think about for my poetry. And it was really fruitful, because I'm not a scientist by trade. I'm just interested in, the fact that we're sitting here spinning on a ball of molten lava in space, just chatting. And it seems really mad and quite interesting. And the more I found out about science and individual ideas, the more it made me want to write and made me want to be creative about it. And in 2008, 2009, I was poet in residence at the Dana Centre at the Science Museum. And each month they would set me a particular topic and I would have to go away and try and write a poem about it. And it was always quite a challenge and quite difficult and quite interesting. And quite a lot of those poems formed my first book. And I think probably one of the reasons that Blood Axe was quite interested in it was because it was a bit different, because I was talking about chemistry and maths and the universe. So it helped me and it inspired me, and I continue to find it really inspiring and interesting.
I mean, it's interesting you should mention those residencies because, I mean, as everyone who's watching will find out, the poems that you're going to read, they mention a lot of, I'd say, theories and these sorts of ideas. And I don't know if you'd call them rules, but yeah, theories maybe the right word. And I wondered if these are things that you've sort of come across yourself, or if those are things that the residencies have propelled you onto writing about.
It depends. Sometimes the residencies set me things, and sometimes I just kind of foraged about in the cupboards and in the libraries and kind of found things that interested me and followed them. I'm going to read in this first section, I'm going to read from Electric Shadow, which was inspired by the Dana Centre residency, and a lot of those were set for me. But then I'll also read a little bit from the Print Museum, and a lot of those I kind of just came up with myself, but I really enjoyed exploring it.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think it's time that we heard some of them. So over to you for your first reading, Heidi.
Okay, so I'll start by reading a little bit from Electric Shadow, which came out in 2011. And as I was kind of saying, quite a few of the poems came out of the residency at the Science Museum in London. They would kind of set me a topic and I'd think, oh no, I don't know how to write about that, and go away and find out more about it and try and find a way in. And a lot of the ways in were to do with the people in science, as well as the ideas and how kind of crazy they seem, but how interesting, and how they underpin everyday life. And one of the first topics they set me was the universe, which was quite a big topic and a bit scary, and I struggled to find a way in. But then I read this article about how since the Big Bang, the universe is accelerating at a great rate of knots, and they don't really know what's going to happen. They don't know whether it's going to sort of keep going and dissipate and kind of, disappear, whether it's going to keep going, reach a certain point and rebound back, and there'll be another Big Bang, or whether it will sort of get to a certain point and freeze. And they were all fairly catastrophic outcomes. There was no sort of happy endings. But I'm a keen motorbiker, so I associate speed with exhilaration. So I wrote this poem, Slide Rule. The universe is running away with itself, like a child on a red bike on Christmas Day. Somewhere the wrapping is still being opened. The present gives itself again and again. And the child hurtles at perfect speed across town towards nothing. Her parents are already looking at the clock, saying, how late it is getting, how the darkness comes so much sooner. It is only a matter of time, they are saying, before she will land awkwardly in an original position, sucking in broken concrete and teeth. Meanwhile, the child on a red bike is running away with herself, like the universe on Christmas Day. And the next poem was inspired by a maths problem, obviously. I was very interested in the kind of statistical ideas to do with, there's something called the travelling salesman problem. And there's an epigraph at the front of the poem that kind of tells you what it is. It says, given a finite number of cities and the cost of travel between each pair of them, find the cheapest way a salesman could visit each city once and return to the starting point. And I kind of thought, well, that's all very well, but if it's a real man in the real world, lots of different things would come into play that you can't possibly put into the equation. And it made me think about a quote from Paul Brodeur, which is, "Statistics are human beings with the tears wiped away." So in the poem, The Travelling Salesman Problem, I kind of took his side a little bit. The Travelling Salesman Problem. He travels in the minds of mathematicians. He has no form but going, a pure line stretched across an unnamed land. The assumption is he has no friends or family to visit to divert his route. There's no time for him to stop for food. You will not see him freewheel down the valley or sit in jams that idly waste his fuel. Seasons would affect the price he has to pay, but where are they? And what of all those things he's flogging? Jets and biros, tractors, axes, train sets, boxes, trucks. Don't they slow him down? Constant questions trail him. And for what? All numbers are imaginary. But look, here he comes towards us now, wielding the calculator in his hand, trying to fathom his value and plot the point of his home. And the next one from this is to do with pregnancy testing, obviously. So we went through quite a while of thinking about starting a family and trying for a family. And anyone that's kind of been there knows that that moment before you take a pregnancy test is life-changing, strange, potentially not life-changing, and it feels quite momentous. And it made me think about Schrodinger's famous thought experiment, the cat in the box, where you don't know if the cat is going to be dead or alive until you open the box. So for that moment, the cat is both dead and alive. And when you're thinking about, am I pregnant, am I not pregnant, you could be, but you don't know, or you could not be, but you don't know. So this is called Schrodinger's pregnancy test. For her, theoretical physics is a bird soaring next to a plane. From her pressurized berth, she glimpses movement rising out of reach. All it takes is a broad mauve line in a window for it to land, bang, on her heart. And I'll read a couple of poems from the Print Museum now, which is this one, which came out in 2016. And it was inspired by a residency again, but this time at the John Jarrell Printing Museum. My dad's a retired printer, and I famously wasn't interested in it when I was growing up, but then became interested in it when I started writing poetry. And the John Jarrell Printing Museum was a terrific place where lots of volunteers went just to do printing. And it's now just started up again at Blickling Hall in an area there. So I'm very pleased that it's still going. While I was writing this book, I kind of decided that each poem in it would have a title from the world of printing. And that was very much just me making that up so that I had something to follow. And I found it quite interesting. And it seemed to kind of cheat towards the end because there are so many words that come from the world of printing that I could write any poem and just find a word that fitted. And one of the first poems in the book was commissioned by an American journal on the theme of sustainability. And because I live in Norfolk, and when I think about the environment and sustainability, I think about the coastline, I wrote this poem called Dimensional Stability. And dimensional stability is paper's property of being able to retain its state whether there's sort of frost or heat or damp. Dimensional stability. The way, for example, paper, retains itself despite damp or heat or frost, or a bird continues to flit on altered airstreams. Out here in the damp margins, flint fractures the fen's panorama with bright towers of churches, primed to call out, if the sea visits without warning, the sites of special scientific interest. The heath of silver-studded blues, woodland where the pool frogs spawn, lagoons where starlit sea anemones practice their minute fission. Instead, the sea deftly extends its lips to the land, worrying stone into flecks of sand, all substance carried under, like the story of the lost town, submerged into history, the lungs of its chapel replete with creatures, the stone floor of its eons-old sea, burgeoning beneath the new town, unsettled. Even now I hear the creak-crack of the pillboxes rusting their way towards France, their iron bars released, as the houses and people and matter progress and regress. The way, for example, the ocean, freeing itself of its borders, falls constantly into its element, its heedless waters closing over our mouths. And I'll finish this section with a poem called Adhesion. Things that are different and disparate adhere, like ink adheres to paper. Adhesion. The way I heard it, she said, the rain would slip down and each blade lift beneath the weight of drops in ecstasy. She said, sleep now, close the folds of your eyes and see blankness, those lights that only you can know. Forget the empty screen, the full book, the broken words. The largest animals on earth have bones the same as yours, and the smallest. The fingers of a bat's wing, the massive heart of a giraffe, all connect their instruments to you. She said this is prayer, if anything is, the simple lift and fall of a lung beneath ribs, beneath skin, and all the myriad functions that spawn it. Forget the frogs beneath frozen ponds, waiting motionless for winter to break. Hear only this breath, its air. Help form the clouds with each outtake. Watch each breath coast towards other lands and creatures. Let it go.
Thank you, Heidi. That was a gorgeous reading and beautifully read, I must say as well. I loved what you said about your father and printing and how you famously didn't like it and now you do. And it kind of it that speaks to what both of you sort of talk about in your poetry, which is not just the relevance of the past, but specifically your parents' legacy and how much that can influence you. And a question that I had this sounds like a very big question, and I do apologise, but thinking about the way that you approach those poems, in my head, it's sort of, a lot of them felt as if they were made for figuring things out. You're using these theories, and I wondered if I wondered what poetry in that way is to you. If poetry is a medium for figuring things out, if that's put quite simply. But I wonder what you think about that.
It very much is for me, very much. I think Margaret Atwood said something along the lines of, poetry is where she takes her questions. If there's something I'm thinking about that I can't get a handle on or I'm interested in, the gap between the words and the thinking seems to be partly where poetry lives for me. I remember, I think it was Simon Armitage saying somewhere once that he would only start a poem if he knew where it ended. And I remember thinking the opposite is completely true for me. It's like, oh, if I knew where a poem ended, I wouldn't begin it. I'm very interested in following the words and the thoughts and seeing what comes out of it. That's my fun. That's my experimenting on the page with the ideas and the words and the thinking.
Would you agree with that, Anne, or would you approach it in a different way?
Yeah, I think I'm the same. I very rarely know where a poem's going to end, and it is a process of exploration. And I remember reading somewhere somebody saying a poem is a postcard to yourself. And when you look back at the poems that you've written and the process you've been through, I find I can just get right back into that and see it retrospectively and see the exploration. It doesn't mean the exploration's finished, but it just captures something in a way that I don't think anything else could for me.
Yeah. And in that reading, Heidi, there are a couple of sort of quotations that just stuck in my head. There was the idea of running away with oneself and plotting the point of home. And there's very much a sense of trying to locate something and looking for something, which I think was beautiful and leads us on quite nicely, I think, to Anne's second reading, which is going to be from your forthcoming book, Rockwell. So could you tell us a little bit about Rockwell and what it's about?
So Rockwell is one of those places that lots of people have heard the name Rockwell, I think. Certainly those of us who remember the shipping forecast, because it's one of the areas that on the radio you got the weather reports for the shipping areas, and Rockwell was one of them. And it had kind of just been in the background. I just, it was a word I heard. And then a few years ago, I was on Twitter, and I saw that Rockwell had tweeted something. And there was a picture of Rockwell, and it's this tiny little rock, which, if the ocean is flat, it's out in the Atlantic Ocean, it's about 60 feet above sea level. So a big wave, and it can go under. And I was curious to know, firstly, who was actually tweeting on behalf of Rockwell, and I still don't know. It generally tweets about what the sea conditions are, but occasionally it tweets some jokey things as well. And funnily enough, we now direct message each other, and it's writing haikus. But I then decided one morning to look at where it was, because I'd never looked. And it's 250 miles off the west coast of Scotland. And the more I started reading about it, the more fascinating it became. And then when we went into lockdown a year last March, I think this was my escapism. I've never been to Rockwell. I get very seasick. I did get in touch with a man called Nick Hancock, who lived on Rockwell for 45 days and was very scared at times. And that was interesting to talk with him. And he's written this book that I read. So I started stalking Rockwell and wondering what went on there, which led to this this collection, which I've written over the last year and a bit.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, let's hear from Rockwell then. I'll hand over to you, Anne.
And so Rockwell is not only the sort of stage for my new collection, it has a voice. It's a rock with a voice. But there are other characters that appear throughout. And the guillemots in particular are abundant around Rockwell. And so the first poem I'm going to read is called Common Guillemot. Common Guillemot. This egg, blue, speckled with black and lilac, I'd recognise it anywhere. This egg contains my little boy, William. This egg has a pointy end, so that if it rolls on a rocky ledge, it will go round in circles. William is my hatchling, my chick. I bring fish to the nest site, to the rocky ledge, and feed his imaginary beak, stuff him to the gizzards. And one of the things I found out while researching birds is, of course, guillemot is the French for William. So there are lots and lots of little Williams and Wilhelminas living on and around Rockwell. And this is the voice of Rockwell, its first piece in the collection. My face is exposed to the east, a sheer drop, dead to the swell, pockmarked by volleying rocks. Kittiwakes live in my pits, rise up when the storms break, then settle again. My face is dark, grey. It takes whatever is thrown at it. I sometimes see ships. I do nothing to attract them, but nevertheless, they come here. And as I learned more about Rockwell, I found that many ships have visited it or tried to visit it. It's very difficult to actually land on Rockwell because the sea has to be very, very flat. So you could quite easily sail for 250 miles and not be able to land. And this next poem is about the first landing on Rockwell, and this was HMS Endymion in September 1811, September the 8th. And I've called it Rockwell Landing One. Given the choice, would you stay on this 40-gun frigate that has sailed so many battles at sea, or would you row in a boat to a god-forsaken rock to experiment, chip specimens, take soundings? And if the fog came down, would you cling to the rock in the perilous sea, or would you try to come back? And if you stay on the rock, would you climb to the peak to search for the masts above the troubled milky fret? Or would you hunker down, build a hurricane house out of a boat and sit it out? Given the choice, would you risk coming back as the ship tacks and turns and the fog closes off behind you, the only point of reference being yourself? And the frigate fires its cannons into the fog, but all that is heard is silence. And Rockwell's perspective on this is as follows. A 40-gun frigate has anchored nearby. Men set out in boats, but as they row towards me, the fog comes down. I lose sight of them, the masts of the frigate. Now out there in the milky fret, their only point of reference is themselves. The frigate fires its cannons into the fog, but all that is heard is silence. So the Endymion was one of a number of boats that visited or tried to visit Rockwell. And as I learned more, I learned about the tragic sinking of a Danish passenger ship called the SS Norwich, which set sail from Denmark to go to America in June 1904. And it hit a rock 100 yards or so off Rockwell and sank, and hundreds of people drowned. These were people on their way to the New World to start new lives in America. And so I've written various poems about this, but this is the voice of the Atlantic on the sinking of the SS Norwich. The sinking of the SS Norwich. I abhor being displaced. I have so much potential energy. I'm constantly checking the hulls of ships. So, a bump, the sound of iron grinding on rock, and I'm in through a rent in the prow, filling the hold with myself. She plunged, yawed, sank by the bows in 12 minutes flat. I dashed 2 lifeboats, sank a third, created a whirling maelstrom as the 4,000 tons dead weight went down, filled hundreds of lungs, silenced their sea mewling. So, as you've heard, 3 of the lifeboats didn't even get away, but 8 others did. And this is about one of them. This lifeboat. They take turns at the oars, bail with a pail and dipper, an orphaned girl, a mother hiding her dead child under her skirts, 2 boys surviving 7. This lifeboat is found at daybreak by a trawler, and one woman in delirious joy offers the trawlerman her wedding ring. And then the last poem that I'm going to read from this collection is about a different type of guillemot, the bridled guillemot. Bridled guillemots have markings around their eyes that make them look like they're wearing spectacles. So they're very wise. The bridled guillemot tells a story. She shifts on the ledge, the downy chicks huddling under her wings. She tells them the story of a visitor, a grey bird, a pigeon, who came in on a storm, a ring on its leg, with the number 33365 on it. 33365 is a very big number. The chicks nod. Even the oldest can only count to 200. Then they run out of guillemots. This pigeon, Billy he was called, said he was a racing pigeon, started out in Pontefract. The chicks say, Ponty what? She draws them a map in the dust on the ledge, not to scale, but sufficient to show how remote Pontefract is. The chicks are amazed, their little eyes wide. He flew all that way. Where was he going to? He said he was heading to Nantucket, on the other side of the pond, wanted to dash but needed to rest. We fed him scraps of fish and seaweed. When he got stronger, he sat on this ledge and told us about humans, buses, Trafalgar Square, how he was trained for distance and speed, could find his way home from any location, the hazards of flying at night, how he never did doping. Then one day he left, heading northwest. Yes, breath of fresh air, she says, and sighs. The chicks are all asleep.
Thank you, Anne. I think it's a great concept for a collection. There's a very intense focus on a place that is totally, well, basically unattainable. Most people can't even reach it or land on it. I think it's a really interesting idea to consider. And that was a lovely selection of poems. Thank you so much for sharing them.
Thank you.
Do you know when are you hoping for this to be out in the world for everyone to go and get a copy of?
Well, it should be out hopefully November this year. And I have a colleague who does very beautiful pen and ink drawings of animals, and she's just been emailing me this morning. She's designing the cover. So that's going to look
fantastic.
very nice, I think.
I'm sure lots of our audience will be keeping an eye out for that later in the year then. And so I think what you did really nicely actually was the way that you gave a voice to Rockwell, but you had that individual voice as well as the collective voice of all of these communities that you mentioned, which leads quite nicely onto Heidi's second reading. And Heidi, you'll be reading from your latest collection, Return by Minor Road. I wondered if you could just explain a little bit about the collection before we hear from it.
So it's very centred on place as well, specifically my time living in Scotland. I moved up there when I was 18 to go to university and stayed up there till I was 30. So very, very formative years. Got married, got my first job, made lifelong friends, and we go back regularly. So this collection, which came out last year, Return by Minor Road, focuses on living there, but also on a particular event that happened When I was in my mid-20s, I was living in a small commuter town called Dunblane when a gunman entered the local primary school and opened fire on a class of 5 and 6-year-olds. And lots of people were killed and injured, and it was obviously a catastrophic event. The whole country was in shock, the community was in shock. And for a long time I didn't write about Scotland, even though I loved it there so much. And so I started to look at that particular event and also the landscape there and how much I love that. So there's a lot of landscape poems in this book about how beautiful and how nourishing it is up there too. So in writing this book, although I looked at something I was trying not to look at, it also opened up Scotland back to me again, and I was able to revisit it in my mind and enjoy being there again.
Well, I can't wait to hear from it. I'll hand over to you for your second reading.
Thank you. We lived in a very, very tiny flat. Our landlord had a beautiful mansion with rose gardens, a small pond and bats and trees and lots of wildlife. And he'd built a flat over his double garage for his gardener. And he ended up renting out to students. So we lived in this tiny flat, but the views from it were amazing. You could see the golf course out the back and Dunblane and the river and the Trossachs in the distance. So this first poem is called The Trees of the Trossachs. The trees of the Trossachs and golf course, framed by the kitchen window and garden, come back to me now in silence. In photographs they interleave the years. Now they are as they were then. They green and golden, wave and wane. Birds have come and gone in them. Nests, storms. Clouds top them with intricate patterning. The wind carries around the world and comes back. A language learned abroad. I also left a skin there. Louise Glick, Cottonmouth Country. Let the language of this land soften into your being. Counter its shifting lilt with a tilt of your own making. You can love what is not understood. In this place, they say, is that you? Are you away but? The language here leaves you drucket, soaked to the skin. Though you can never catch up what you say with what you mean. There are words for child and flight. You can take in and wean. Loch Occasional. Midwinter or spring. Sometimes the Balvague floods Balquidder Glen, gives rise to a short-lived body. This uncommon water hosts fresh species that feed and breed there. Sculpin, caddisflies, pearl mussels. The flood may recede as rapidly as it arrived. Landslides may follow. This too opens up the canopies, the strata of soil. Buried nutrients, seeds, live plant matter is scattered. Silt beds down. The surface tension levels. The landscape is transformed again. Sudden creatures enrich the area or deplete it. Fragments enter the disturbed ground. waken. Spring or midwinter, at other times too, the silt of what happened rises and drops with the level of days. Sometimes it covers all daily tasks with an oily sheen that dimples when pressed, then releases the surface tension the water's skin. Forced out to the edges of itself, all becomes water. It may recede, but the days are not transformed. The days are delayed, waiting for the water to come back, to scatter live matter back in its place. The occasional endures. Return by minor road. Can you say that a man is lost just because you cannot distinguish him from the background? Cole Swenson. We go back quietly in surprising sunshine. The warmth opens us as our child sweats into the Scottish air, declaring the hill too long a mountain. He says the light tastes different here. It nestles on our tongues. Dark pillars of firs line the driveway down to our old home. The once green cottage window frames are grey, making the house look shabbier, or more in keeping with the usual weather. We visit the current tenants, drink tea, make small talk. After our son lopes ahead, back down to the memorial bear and fox, rests his wrists on their cool marble. A good way to recalibrate the body. Inside the cathedral, the air channels towards the altar. A rabbit, a camel, all manner of creatures perch at the end of pews, in clean-cut wood the colour of hazelnuts. On the graveyard wall, an emptied can of Tennant's super is haloed by sunlight. In the hotel, we play a racing game, brought down from the bookshelves. He gallops his foot horses, forwards, forwards. Dunblane. Walking the hill to our old flat. The pubs and benches we used to visit accumulate behind us. The golf club rests greenly in its aisle. The old new Tesco seems emptier now. We discover play parks, museums, heritage sites that as students we never deigned to find. We watch the future we dare not presume, run ahead towards the climbing frames, the swirled slide that delivers him lightly onto the earth. And I'll finish with the final poem in the book, which is simply called Place, but it's very clear which place I'm talking about. When we left it all. The hazel, the spruce, the Scots pine, the aspen. When we left, we took it all. The skyscapes and treescapes framing each season. When we left it all. the bracken, the cabins, the pathways of water. When we left, we took it all. The hollows, chill soil, ice air and snowfall. When we left it all. Angular boulders with ashy thin grasses. When we left, we took it all. Scent of just rained on, expanding the stonework. When we left it all. Pine martens, red deer, herons and osprey. When we left, we took it all. Broadening rain clouds, blending with hillsides. When we left it all. Short-lived, supple, islands of shingle. When we left, we took it all. The bend in the loch. We can't see beyond.
Thank you, Heidi. That was a stunning reading and a beautiful poem to end on, I think. Thank you so much for sharing those. I wondered if if you'd found it difficult writing this collection given the focus, or if once you started it came quite naturally and quite easily.
I found it very difficult to write it, and I didn't really want to write about it. But poems became a way of starting to think about it. And a wise friend kind of said to me, you can just take that time out and look at it. So I started to look at it in poems. And as I said at the beginning, it kind of gave me my enjoyment and my love of that place back as well in words. So yeah, it was difficult to write about, and also trying to honour the people there, the community there, and not claim too much, because I didn't have children, I just had friends who were affected. But it did kind of stay with me, and it did impact me quite a lot. So I was trying to be very careful about my stance and my thinking about it, and very honest about that.
Yeah, and there was one line that stuck out to me, which was "the occasional endures," and it felt very symbolic of the whole reading, and as if the collection is almost a way of retaining that part, as that's quite clear. But that one line, I think, really stuck out to me. And I did also wonder, the epigraphs for these poems all work beautifully. It's sort of a bit of a chicken or the egg question, which came first. Did the poems come and then these quotations were inserted quite naturally, or did you find these quotations and poems maybe stemmed from those?
A bit of both. I collect quotes that really move me or surprise me or intrigue me, and I read so much, particularly a lot of poetry, and I'm sure it's the same for Anne. Reading other people I find very inspiring for thinking about work. So some of them came in quite naturally after the poem had been written. It just felt like they connected together very well, and others inspired poems. So yeah, kind of, it is very much one or the other, or both at times.
Yeah. Well, as I said, a beautiful note to end this event on. We have come to the end of this Meet the Poet, and I do want to say a huge thank you to Anne and Heidi for taking the time to share your poetry with us. You've both been fantastic guests, and I found it so interesting seeing how you've both woven from ideas of identity and community and legacy and place. It's all fitted together really nicely. To everyone who's watching at home, if you'd like to find out about more poetry events like these, then you can sign up to the Homestage Poetry mailing list, and you can be notified about any upcoming events like this one. So thanks again to Heidi Williamson and Anne Osbourn, and I'll see everyone at home next time.